The first time I noticed my name missing, I assumed it was a clerical mistake. That's the thing about systems. You're trained quietly over a lifetime to trust them more than your own instincts. If a screen says something is wrong, you assume you misunderstood. If a form rejects you, you assume you typed something incorrectly. If a record doesn't show up, you assume it's lag or maintenance or human error somewhere far enough away that it doesn't feel personal. At least that's how it starts. It was late February. I remember because the winter hadn't broken yet, but it was trying to. The air had that damp, metallic smell it gets when snow has melted into gray piles along the curb and refrozen overnight. Everything felt half awake, half functioning. I had a routine appointment, nothing serious, nothing dramatic. Annual checkup. Blood pressure, blood work, the usual questions I already knew how to answer without thinking. I'd taken the morning off work, stopped for gas, parked in the same medical office lot I'd parked in for years. The building hadn't changed. Beige brick, smudged glass doors. The same plastic sign listing half a dozen practices stacked vertically like an afterthought. Inside, the lobby lights hummed. The check-in kiosks were lined up against the wall, glowing softly. A few people sat scattered across vinyl chairs, all of us carefully not making eye contact. I stepped up to the kiosk, tapped the screen, and followed the prompts. Last name, first name, date of birth. The loading wheel spun. It spun longer than usual, just long enough for me to notice, just long enough for a faint irritation to surface. Then the screen reset. I tried again, slower this time, deliberately pressing each letter as if precision mattered. Same result. The wheel spun. The system hesitated, then nothing. A message appeared, no matching appointment found. I frowned. I knew I had one. I'd confirmed it online 2 days earlier. I glanced over at the receptionist's desk, where a woman in her 40s was typing steadily, her posture rigid in that way people develop when they spend their lives behind counters. I stepped over and explained. She nodded without really listening, already pulling up her terminal. Last name, she asked. I told her. She typed, paused, typed again. She said. That was it, just a sound. No alarm, no concern. Can you spell it? She asked. I spelled it slowly. I'd spelled it my whole life. There's nothing unusual about it. Plain, common enough. She leaned closer to the screen. And your date of birth? I told her. She tried again. Then she searched by phone number, then by social security number. Her forehead creased slightly, like she was solving a puzzle she didn't want. That's strange, she said finally. It's not coming up. She said it the way people say that's strange asterisk, when they mean this happens sometimes, and I don't want to deal with it. It's probably just not syncing, she added quickly. I can check you in manually. She printed a temporary sticker, white instead of the usual blue, and slid it across the counter. It didn't have my name on it, just a barcode and a number. I stuck it to my jacket without thinking. I sat down and waited. The appointment went normally, too normally. The nurse called me by my first name only, glancing at her tablet like it was missing something. The doctor asked if I'd changed insurance providers recently. I said no. He nodded, already moving on. When I left, I noticed something small. No one asked for my insurance card. I told myself it didn't matter. That night, I checked my email. Nothing unusual. My appointment summary wasn't there yet, but sometimes it took a day. I went to bed thinking about nothing in particular. The next morning, my payroll deposit wasn't in my bank account. At first, I thought it was a delay. Sometimes holidays mess with things. I checked the date. It was Friday, not a holiday. I waited until noon, then 2. By mid-afternoon, I logged into the payroll portal. It took longer than usual to load. When it finally did, the screen looked thinner, simplified. My name was missing from the header. There was a notice instead. Employee status, inactive. I stared at it longer than I should have. Inactive didn't mean terminated, I knew that. Terminated had its own category. Inactive was usually for people on leave, or retirees, or employees whose profiles hadn't been touched in a while. But I'd clocked in every day that week. I walked down to HR. They were apologetic, confused. One of them, a younger woman who'd started after me, frowned at her screen and said, That's weird, you're not populating. She tried searching by employee ID. That worked, kind of. My profile appeared, but parts of it were grayed out. My emergency contact field was blank. My address showed only the street name, no number. Did you move recently? She asked. No. She shrugged. It's been rolling out updates. She submitted a ticket, promised it would resolve, told me to keep working and they'd issue a manual check if needed. I went back to my desk. My badge still worked, the doors still opened, my computer logged in without issue. My email inbox filled the way it always had. But when I hovered over my own name in a reply thread, nothing happened. No contact card, no details. I didn't mention it to anyone. That weekend, I started checking things. Not obsessively, not yet, just cautiously, like touching a sore tooth with your tongue. I logged into my credit card account. The dashboard loaded, but my name was missing from the top corner. Instead, it displayed asterisk account holder asterisk. I checked my pharmacy app. My prescription history was there, but my profile photo was gone. The edit personal information button didn't work. On Sunday night, I tried the state licensing portal for my profession. The site asked for my license number. I entered it. No active record found. I refreshed, tried again. Same result. That was the first moment something real shifted inside me. Not panic, not fear. A kind of slow pressure, like a weather change you feel in your joints before you see clouds. I told myself systems glitch. I told myself databases are messy. I told myself this was all connected to some back-end migration no one had thought through. But another thought had started forming, quiet, persistent. This wasn't random. By the end of the month, my middle initial disappeared from most records. Where it once read first M last asterisk, it now read first last asterisk. It seemed insignificant. I'd never cared much about the initial. But I noticed it. In March, my apartment management portal updated. When I logged in, my name was gone. In its place was a tenant ID number. The lease document still existed, but the signature page showed a blank line where my name should have been. I emailed the property office. They replied 2 days later, addressing me as resident. When I followed up, they apologized and said their new system sometimes drops name fields. I asked them to correct it. They didn't. At work, my name slowly stopped appearing in places it should have. Team rosters, org charts, automated emails congratulating people on anniversaries. No one mentioned it. I began to notice how often people rely on prompts to acknowledge you. How often a screen tells them who you are before they speak. Without those prompts, interactions felt incomplete, not hostile, just abbreviated. One evening, I tried to update my address with the DMV. The site accepted my information, then kicked me back to the login screen without explanation. I tried again and again. Finally, a message appeared. We are unable to verify your identity at this time. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark living room for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum. The word verify stuck with me. Verification implies a reference point, something external, something already agreed upon. What happens when that reference point disappears? A week later, the letter arrived. It was already inside my mailbox when I opened it, lying flat, perfectly aligned with the others. No stamp, no postmark, no return address. Just my street address, typed. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Status update, resident record under review. No logo, no explanation, no contact information. Just a date. I sat at my kitchen table and read it over and over, trying to find a tone in the words. A hint of intent. There wasn't one. The paper felt heavier than it should have. That night, I slept badly. I dreamed about forms that wouldn't submit, about standing at counters that kept extending away from me as I approached. I woke up before my alarm, heart pounding, and realized something else. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen my full name printed correctly anywhere. I started documenting things then. Screenshots, photos, notes with dates and times. I didn't know what I was preparing for, only that I felt like I needed proof. Proof of what, I wasn't sure. I took a day off work and drove to the county records office. The building was older than it looked from the outside. Inside, the air smelled like dust and toner. The floors were scuffed from decades of shoes. The lighting was uneven, casting shadows in corners where no one ever stood. I took a number and waited. When my turn came, I explained carefully. I kept my voice even. I'd learned that urgency makes people defensive. The clerk typed my name. She paused, typed it again. "You're not pulling," she said. She tried searching by address. My building came up immediately. My unit number was there. The occupant field was empty. She stared at it for a moment longer than she needed to. "That's odd," she said. "What does that mean?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she glanced over her shoulder like someone might be listening. "It usually means the record is in transition." "Transition to what?" She didn't answer, just printed a generic information sheet and slid it toward me. I left with nothing resolved. As the date on the letter approached, things accelerated. My debit card declined at a grocery store. The cashier apologized, assuming it was my bank. I used a credit card instead. That worked once. 2 days later, it didn't. I called customer service, navigated menus, entered my account number. When a representative finally answered, she asked for my name. I gave it. There was a pause. "I'm not seeing that account," she said. I read her the number. She confirmed it existed, but she couldn't attach it to a person. "Can you verify your identity?" she asked. I tried. Nothing matched. At work, my manager pulled me aside. "Corporate can't see you," he said, half joking, half uncomfortable. "You're like a ghost." He laughed. I didn't. He said to give it a few days. That night, a police officer knocked on my door. "Routine welfare check," he said. Someone had flagged my unit as unverified occupancy. He asked me to state my name. When I did, he wrote it down phonetically, slowly, carefully, like it might not hold its shape. After he left, I sat on the floor and felt something settle. Not fear, acceptance, because deep down, I understood something then. This wasn't a mistake that needed fixing. It was a conclusion that had already been reached. And whatever was happening to me had been happening quietly, patiently, long before I noticed my name was gone. I stopped sleeping normally after that. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't lie awake all night staring at the ceiling. It was worse than that. I slept, but it felt shallow, like my mind refused to fully settle anywhere. I'd wake up every hour or so with the vague sense that something had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. I started leaving lights on. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because waking up to a lit room reminded me that time had passed in a predictable way, that I hadn't been paused or skipped over. In the mornings, I checked my phone first thing. No notifications, no service bars, just the time ticking forward like it always had. At least that still worked. I went to work anyway. No one stopped me. The doors opened. My badge beeped green. The building still recognized the shape of my presence, if nothing else. But inside the office, things were thinner. My nameplate was gone from my desk. I hadn't removed it. I was sure of that. It had been there for years, slightly crooked, the adhesive weak on one corner. Now there was just a clean rectangle of dust where it used to be. I checked the seating chart pinned near the break room. Everyone else's name was there. Mine wasn't. When I sat down, my computer logged in automatically, but my desktop background had reset to the default. All my folders were still there, but the labels looked faint, like the font weight had been reduced. I sent an email to my manager asking for an update on HR. It bounced back. No explanation, just a generic delivery failure. I didn't forward it, didn't escalate. I felt a strange reluctance to draw attention to myself, like moving too abruptly might finish whatever process had already started. Around mid-morning, a coworker stopped by my desk to ask a question. We'd worked together for years. We talked almost every day. He stood there for a second longer than usual before speaking. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He hesitated. His eyes flicked to my monitor, then back to my face. "Sorry," he said, laughing softly. I just blanked for a second. "About what?" "Your name," he said. "It'll come back to me." I waited. It didn't. He asked his question. got his answer, and left, still smiling faintly, like he'd misplaced something minor and decided it wasn't worth the effort of looking. That was when I realized this wasn't just happening inside systems. Something about me was becoming harder to retrieve. Over the next few days, similar moments stacked up. A barista hesitating mid-order. A neighbor greeting me without using my name, even though she always had before. A calendar invite listing me as. I started testing things quietly. I introduced myself to people who already knew me just to see their reaction. Most of them accepted it without comment, like the name was new information that fit easily into place. A few looked relieved, as if I'd saved them from an awkward admission. I checked my mailbox obsessively. Bills still arrived, but they were different. Some were addressed to resident. Others had my name partially truncated, as if the system had run out of characters halfway through. One envelope arrived completely blank, except for my apartment number. Inside was a utility notice, informing me that service would continue uninterrupted. No account holder listed. Just confirmation that power, water, heat, all of it would remain active. For who, it didn't say. The date on the original letter crept closer. I tried calling the number listed on the county website for records inquiries. The line rang, then routed me to a voicemail box that was full. I drove there again, hoping to catch someone different. The clerk recognized me, or at least her face suggested she did, but she didn't greet me. She just waited. I came in last week, I said, about my residency record. She typed, her brow furrowed. There's nothing pending under that unit, she said. But there was. She shook her head. It's stable now. Stable how? She met my eyes briefly, then looked away. Occupied, she said, but unassigned. I asked her what that meant. She printed something and slid it across the counter. It was a generic page, explaining how certain records could exist without personal attribution during audits, restructurings, or system harmonization. Harmonization, I repeated. She didn't respond. I left feeling hollowed out, like I'd just been told about my own absence in neutral terms. That night, I tried something I hadn't done yet. I searched my name online. Not social media, not places I'd expect to find myself. I searched public records, old mentions, archived PDFs. There were results, but fewer than there should have been. Articles I knew I'd been quoted in still existed, but my name had been replaced with a local employee. A community event photo caption no longer listed me among the volunteers. Even my college alumni page showed a blank where my profile used to be. I realized then that this wasn't moving forward. It was moving backward. Rewriting. Correcting. I started thinking about all the moments in a life that only exist because they're recorded somewhere. Birth certificates, enrollment forms, licenses, employment records, medical charts. Remove those and what's left? Memory. And memory is unreliable. I woke up one morning and couldn't remember the exact spelling of my own middle name. That scared me more than anything else so far. I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, saying my full name out loud, over and over like repetition might anchor it. It sounded right, familiar, but also strangely fragile, like a word in a foreign language you stop using and slowly forget how to pronounce. The morning of the date listed on the letter, my phone displayed no service asterisk. I stepped outside anyway. The lobby directory had been updated overnight. My apartment number was there. The space beside it was empty. No placeholder, no dash, just blank. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the building, the distant traffic, the ordinary sounds of a world that was still moving forward without needing me to be properly accounted for. And for the first time, a thought surfaced fully formed, undeniable, and cold. If this process completed, if whatever system was doing this reached its endpoint, there might be nothing left that officially objected to my absence. And I wasn't sure what would happen then. To me, or to the space I was still standing in. I stayed in the lobby until the automatic lights dimmed. Not fully off, just enough to signal that the building had decided no one important was there anymore. I didn't know how long I stood in front of that directory, staring at the blank space where my name used to be. Long enough that it stopped feeling like something had been taken and started feeling like something had been corrected. I went back upstairs and locked my door. That was the first night I didn't turn any lights on. I sat on the couch in the dark, listening to the building breathe, pipes ticking, elevators groaning somewhere far below, a neighbor's television bleeding muffled dialogue through the wall. All of it sounded the same as it always had. The world hadn't noticed the change. That was the worst part. Around midnight, my phone buzzed once. No notification, just the vibration. The screen stayed black. I tried to turn it on, nothing happened. I held the power button until my thumb ached. Still nothing. It wasn't dead. I'd charged it earlier, it just refused. I set it face down on the table and felt a sudden, sharp urge to write things down. Not thoughts, not feelings. Facts. I found a notebook in a drawer and started listing what I could still verify without permission from a system. I wrote my full name at the top of the page. Carefully, slowly. I paused after each letter, checking it against the memory of how it was supposed to look. Then I wrote my date of birth, the city where I was born, the address I was sitting in. Each line felt heavier than the last. When I finished, I closed the notebook and pressed my hand flat against the cover, like I was trying to keep something from escaping. The next morning, my alarm didn't go off. I woke up late, disoriented, the room washed in gray light. For a split second, I couldn't remember why I felt so tense. Then it all rushed back at once. I went to work anyway. My badge worked one last time. Inside, my desk was gone. Not moved, not reassigned, gone. The space where it had been was empty, already cleaned. No chair, no cables, no scuff marks from years of use. It was like I'd never occupied it at all. I stood there, briefcase in hand, while people walked past me without slowing. No one asked what I was doing. No one asked who I was. I wasn't trespassing. I just wasn't anything. I checked the conference room schedules. My name wasn't on any of them. I checked the internal directory. Searching my name returned no results. Searching my employee ID returned an error. I walked into my manager's office. He looked up confused, but not startled. "Oh," he said, "hey. Do you see me?" I asked. He laughed reflexively, then stopped when he saw my face. "Of course I do," he said, but there was uncertainty under it now, a hesitation, like he was answering from habit instead of conviction. "I don't exist in the system anymore," I said. He frowned and turned his monitor toward me. "I don't see, I mean there's no," he stopped, swallowed. "This is probably just a back-end issue. Am I still employed here?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "There's no record of your termination." That was the closest thing to reassurance he could offer. Security escorted me out an hour later. They were polite, apologetic. They said the access logs showed an unregistered presence moving through restricted areas. They said it wasn't personal. At the front desk, they asked me to sign a form acknowledging the incident. The signature line was blank. No name field. Just a line. I hesitated, then signed anyway. As I handed it back, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The pen felt heavier in my hand than it should have, like it was resisting being associated with me. Outside, the city moved the way it always had. Cars, pedestrians, sirens somewhere far off. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, unsure where I was supposed to go now that no destination recognized me. I tried my bank again. The branch teller couldn't find my account, not even with the number. She said the funds were still there, but they were unclaimed. I asked her what that meant. "It means there's no verified owner," she said. "Eventually they get transferred." Transferred to who? She didn't know. I walked home. My key still worked, the door still opened. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it. Except the notebook. It was still on the table, but when I opened it, the first page was blank. My handwriting was gone. Not smudged, not faded. Gone. I flipped through the pages frantically. Every line I'd written had been erased with impossible precision. The paper was pristine, like it had never been touched. That was the moment I understood something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about losing access. This was about continuity, about whether there was enough agreement left anywhere, that I had ever been here at all. I sat down slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast, I might slip out of alignment with the room. And in the quiet, with no devices working, no systems responding, no records left to consult, a new fear settled in, deeper and colder than the rest. If I couldn't prove myself to the world anymore, I stopped trying to fix it after the notebook erased itself. Up until then, some part of me still believed this was a problem that could be corrected if I pushed in the right place. If I found the right office, the right person, the right form that hadn't been updated yet. When the pages went blank, that belief finally collapsed. Something quieter took its place. Observation. The instinct you see in animals that have learned resistance only tightens the snare. They stop struggling. They conserve energy. They watch. Part 2 didn't begin with panic or anger. It began with withdrawal. I stopped logging in, stopped calling numbers that led nowhere, stopped expecting an explanation. I stayed inside my apartment for 3 days, not hiding, just existing without witnesses. I unplugged the router. The sudden absence of its low electronic hum made the space feel larger and emptier at the same time. I didn't check email. I didn't open apps. I used nothing that asked me who I was. Time stretched strangely. Meals lost their rhythm. I ate when I remembered, slept when exhaustion won. On the second day, a notice appeared under my door. No name, no unit number, just a single sheet of paper. It informed the occupant that access credentials would soon be updated to reflect current residency data. I sat on the floor and reread that phrase until it stopped sounding like language. Current residency data. That was when I understood this wasn't an error. Errors produce contradictions. This produced alignment. Whatever was happening wasn't breaking systems. It was synchronizing them. Every database, every record, every automated decision was slowly agreeing on the same conclusion. That I didn't quite fit anymore. That night the heat shut off. Not fully, just enough to make the apartment feel hostile. Cold pooled near the windows. The pipes went quiet like they were holding their breath. I used a neighbor's phone to call emergency maintenance. When I gave my unit number, the operator paused. "There's no active resident listed," she said. "But the unit exists," I replied. "Yes," she said carefully, "the unit exists." Without a listed account holder, she couldn't send anyone. I slept on the couch that night, fully dressed, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, listening to my own breathing just to reassure myself it still sounded real. On the 4th day, I went outside. I needed to know whether this rejection was confined to records, or if the city itself had begun to participate. I walked to a cafe I'd been going to for years. The barista looked at me expectantly. "Coffee," I said, "black." She rang it up, frowned at the screen, tried again. "It didn't register," she muttered. After a moment, she waved it off. "It's fine." I paid in cash anyway. When I sat down, I noticed something wrong. No one was looking at me. Not deliberately avoiding eye contact, just not focusing. Their gazes skimmed past me the way they skim past background objects. Chairs, plants, walls. I tested it. I stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. A few heads turned, then turned away almost immediately, as if their minds had corrected a false alert. I felt lightheaded, not weak, untethered. Like attention had a threshold I no longer met. On the walk home, I passed a construction site. The foreman shouted, "Hey, watch it." Relief surged through me for half a second. Then I realized he was yelling at a forklift behind me. That night, I heard movement in the apartment next door. The unit had been empty for months. I knew because I'd complained about the noise during renovations. I knew because the mailbox had stayed empty. Now there were footsteps, measured, confident. A voice murmured through the wall, calm, familiar in its certainty. The next morning, there was a name on that mailbox. Not mine. A name I didn't recognize. I went to the leasing office. The woman behind the desk smiled politely, then hesitated when she tried to pull up my file. "We don't have you listed as a resident," she said. "I live there," I told her. She checked again, slower this time. "There's a new tenant scheduled to move into that unit next week." Something inside me detached, not broke, just let go. "What happens to my belongings?" I asked. She blinked. "Are you a previous occupant?" "No," I said. "I'm the current one." She tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to reconcile my face with an image that no longer existed. "I can't help without a leaseholder name," she said gently. "I'm sorry." I left before security became necessary. After that, I stayed in motion. Walking felt safer than stopping, like standing still might allow the world to finish settling without me in it. I noticed patterns. Public spaces tolerated me longer than private ones. Sidewalks, parks, libraries, though I couldn't check anything out. Automatic doors hesitated. Motion sensors delayed. Faucets sometimes didn't respond. Nothing dramatic, nothing consistent. But cumulative. Reality resisted me. One afternoon, I followed a man who looked almost exactly like me. Same height, similar build, same haircut. I don't know why I did it, something instinctive. He moved easily through the world, badge on his belt, phone in his hand. People addressed him by name. My name. I stopped walking. He didn't notice. I stood there watching as the world responded to him the way it used to respond to me. That was when it became clear. I wasn't just being erased. I was being replaced. Not by a copy, but by a correction. A version that fit better. That night I slept under an overpass, traffic roaring overhead. I expected fear, panic. Instead, I felt something colder. A narrowing. Like the number of possible futures was shrinking. And somewhere ahead, just out of sight, was a final version of the world. One where no explanation would be required for my absence. Because there would be nothing left that remembered I was ever supposed to be there at all. I learned quickly that sleeping outside changed the rules. Indoors, I still disrupted systems. I still occupied coordinates someone else expected to be empty. Outside, I blended into categories the city already struggled to account for. Unhoused, transient, unregistered. It wasn't safety, but it was tolerance. Morning came without ceremony. Light filtering through gaps in concrete. Traffic overhead never fully stopped. It just surged and receded like a mechanical tide. I waited until my body felt heavy enough to move before standing. When I did, no one noticed. I walked until my legs burned, then farther. The city felt different now, not hostile exactly. Indifferent in a way that felt deliberate. I tried to enter a public restroom in a transit station. The door didn't unlock. I watched 3 people use it before me without issue. When I reached for the handle again, it remained unresponsive. No error, no denial, just nothing. I laughed quietly at that, a short, humorless sound. I was still there, still visible, still casting a shadow. But I was no longer addressable. By the end of the week, I had learned which places stalled and which flowed around me. Libraries allowed me to sit but not log in. Buses let me ride if I paid cash, but drivers never acknowledged me directly. Hospitals were worse. I didn't try twice. I started to notice something else, too. Reflections. Sometimes, when I passed a window or a darkened screen, there was a delay. Not a missing reflection, just a momentary hesitation, like the image needed to be negotiated. Once, I stopped in front of a storefront and watched my reflection blink a fraction of a second after I did. I didn't test it again. I began writing again, not in a notebook but on scraps of paper. Receipts, flyers, anything disposable. I didn't write my name. I described sensations, locations, patterns, proofs that I still occupied time in a linear way. But the longer I did this, the more unstable it felt, like I was anchoring myself to something that didn't want to hold. One afternoon, I returned to my old building. I don't know why, curiosity maybe, or grief. I stood across the street and watched people come and go. When the door opened, I saw inside. My couch was gone. Different furniture, different light. Through the window, I saw movement. Someone else lived there now. Later, I saw him again, the man with my name. This time closer. He stood at a crosswalk, scrolling through his phone. Same posture, same nervous habit of shifting weight from one foot to the other. When the light changed, he crossed without looking up. I followed. Up close, the differences became apparent. His face was smoother. His clothes fit better. There was a cohesion to him I hadn't realized I'd lost. He stopped at a food truck. The vendor greeted him warmly. Usual. He smiled, yeah. I stood a few feet away, watching as my life continued without me. For a moment, just one, I felt something dangerous. An urge to interrupt. To say something, anything. To force the world to choose. But I didn't, because I knew how it would resolve. Not in my favor. That night, I dreamed for the first time in days. I dreamed I was standing in a room full of filing cabinets. Endless rows, every drawer labeled with a name. Mine was still there. I opened it. Inside was nothing. When I woke up, I realized something had changed. I no longer felt like I was moving through the world. I felt like I was being carried past it. As if the present was advancing without waiting for me to catch up. I tested something small the next morning. I stood in the middle of a sidewalk and didn't move. People flowed around me effortlessly. No irritation. No collisions. Their paths adjusted as if I were a static obstacle the city had always accounted for. After several minutes, I stepped aside. No one noticed the difference. That was when the thought arrived fully formed, heavy and unavoidable. The world wasn't forgetting me anymore. It had finished. What remained was cleanup. And I was still here, not because I belonged, but because I hadn't yet reached the point where my absence required no explanation at all. Somewhere ahead, there was a moment I wouldn't pass through. A moment that would close without resistance. And when it did, nothing would follow me. Not even silence. After that realization, time stopped behaving the way it used to. Hours didn't blur together or race ahead. They stacked, one on top of another, heavy, uneven. I became acutely aware of how long everything took, how long it took to cross a street to wait for a light to finish chewing food. The future no longer pulled at me. There was no anticipation, no forward tension, just duration. I kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. Movement still registered, even if *I didn't. I learned to read the city by its responses, which intersections slowed, which doors hesitated, which systems pretended I wasn't there and which ones struggled before giving up. It wasn't consistent, but it was directional, like pressure finding the weakest points. At night, I stayed where others already were. Bus stations. Underpasses with small clusters of people who had learned the same lesson I was learning now, that isolation made you easier to erase. No one asked my name. That was a relief. Names felt volatile, unstable, like calling attention to something that wanted to collapse. Sometimes I listened to conversations without participating. People talked about work, about rent increases, about minor grievances that felt impossibly distant. Their words passed through me without friction. I could understand them intellectually, but emotionally they belonged to a different layer of reality. Once a man sat beside me on a bench and complained about his phone service. He waved the device angrily, saying it hadn't worked right all day. I wondered if I was the reason. I didn't say anything. Sleep came in fragments, short, shallow drops into unconsciousness followed by abrupt awakenings. When I dreamed, the dreams were thin, mostly empty spaces, hallways without doors, rooms without corners. I started to lose track of how long I'd been like this. Days were marked only by hunger and light. On one of those days, I tried something reckless. I followed the man again. Not closely enough to be noticed, not far enough to lose him. He moved through the city with an ease that felt obscene. His phone buzzed frequently. He smiled at messages. People stopped him to talk. He complained about small inconveniences. He was late to a meeting once, and the apology he offered was accepted immediately, without consequence. That hurt more than I expected. I watched him enter an office building downtown. Glass facade, security desk, badge scanner. I stood across the street. staring at the reflection of myself layered faintly over the building's interior. For a moment, I considered walking in behind him, tailgating through the doors the way people sometimes do when they assume belonging. I knew what would happen. The doors might open, or they might not. Either way, the system would reconcile the discrepancy, and I would lose something I hadn't realized I was still holding. Restraint felt like survival. I sat on a concrete planter and waited. When he came back out hours later, dusk had settled. He looked tired, human. I followed him to a grocery store. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed. I drifted through the aisles, watching him select items I recognized. Brands I used to buy, habits I thought were mine. At checkout, the cashier greeted him by name again. I stood one register away. The screen above my register stayed blank. The cashier glanced at me, then away, then back again, confusion flickering briefly across her face before smoothing out. "I'll be right with you," she said automatically, though she didn't move. I waited. Eventually, she closed the register light without explanation. I left the store empty-handed. Outside, the man loaded groceries into his car. He paused, keys in hand, and frowned, just for a second, like he'd forgotten something. My breath caught. Then his phone rang. The moment passed. I realized then that whatever process had replaced me wasn't perfect. It just didn't care about the errors it left behind. As long as they were quiet, as long as they didn't demand reconciliation. That night, rain started without warning, cold and steady. I stood beneath an awning and watched it soak the street. The water pooled around my shoes, but I barely felt it. Sensations were dulling, not disappearing, just losing urgency. Pain still existed, but it didn't command attention the way it used to. Hunger too, even fear felt distant, like an echo. I wondered if that was the point. If this was how the world reduced friction. By making the erased complicit in their own removal. I found a public computer terminal in a community center the next day. Old, slow, barely maintained. I sat down and waited for the login screen. It didn't appear. The screen stayed black. I waved my hand in front of the sensor. Nothing. A volunteer walked over. "You have to wake it up," she said kindly, reaching past me to tap the keyboard. The screen lit immediately. She smiled at me, then hesitated. "Oh," she said softly. "Sorry, I thought you were someone else." She walked away without another word. The screen timed out seconds later. I didn't try again. By then, a new sensation had started to creep in. Compression. Like the space I occupied was being gently but relentlessly reduced. Not physically, I wasn't shrinking, but socially, perceptually. The margins around me were narrowing. People stood closer than they used to, brushing past me without noticing. Doors closed a fraction of a second sooner. Conversations ended just before I arrived. I began to feel late to everything. Not late in time, late in relevance. I stopped looking at my reflection altogether. I didn't want to know what negotiations were happening there now. One evening, I returned to the underpass and found my usual spot occupied. A small group sat there, talking quietly. I hovered nearby, uncertain. No one acknowledged me. After a moment, I sat anyway. A woman glanced in my direction, then looked away. Her eyes slid past me without landing, not avoidance, adjustment. I realized then that I had crossed some internal threshold. I wasn't even an anomaly anymore. I was background noise. That frightened me more than being replaced. Because background noise doesn't get corrected. It gets filtered out. I tried to speak that night, not to anyone in particular, just to hear my voice assert itself into the world. "Excuse me," I said. The sound came out normal, solid. No one reacted. I raised my voice slightly. "Hey." "Nothing." Panic fluttered briefly, then receded. Even that response felt blunted now. I stood and walked away, my footsteps swallowed by traffic. Later, lying on cardboard beneath the overpass, I felt something shift internally. A loosening. Like I was letting go of a grip I'd been maintaining unconsciously. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. Stopped imagining confrontations. stopped hoping someone would notice. The relief was immediate and unsettling. Without resistance, the process felt smoother. I wondered how many others had reached this point before me. How many had simply thinned out. The city was full of people-shaped gaps. I was starting to see them. Figures no one quite focused on. Movements that didn't quite register. Presences that never became subjects. I'd mistaken them for exhaustion, for indifference, for my own projection. Now I knew better. They were like me. Or like what I was becoming. One morning I woke up disoriented, not from a dream but from silence. The traffic overhead had paused, an unnatural lull. For a moment, the absence of sound felt like pressure. Then it returned all at once, louder than before. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I checked myself instinctively, hands, arms, breath. Still here, but the sense of imminence had grown stronger. Like something ahead of me was closing. Not violently, not suddenly. Just conclusively. I started to feel moments approaching that I would not pass through. Conversations that would continue without me. Days that would not include my awareness. Spaces I would never enter again, not because I was barred, but because the path simply wouldn't extend that far. I thought about the filing cabinets from my dream. About the empty drawer. Maybe that was all that remained of me now. An open slot that had already been cleared. The question wasn't whether I would disappear. That was already settled. The question was how much of myself would still be conscious when it happened. And whether, when the final reconciliation occurred, I would even recognize it as an ending. Or if it would feel like the most natural thing in the world to simply stop being addressed at all. I didn't mark the transition when it happened. There was no clear line between asterisk existing on the margins and being absorbed by them. It crept in quietly, disguised as efficiency. Fewer reactions, less resistance. The world stopped bumping into me because it no longer needed to root around me. It had learned. I noticed it first in sound. Sirens used to cut through everything, sharp and urgent. Now they felt distant even when they passed close enough to vibrate the air. Conversations blurred into a single low-frequency hum, like I was listening through a wall that kept thickening. Language itself felt flatter. Words still had meaning, but they didn't hook asterisk into me the way they once did. I could hear someone speak and understand them perfectly, yet feel no impulse to respond. Not apathy, alignment, as if my responses were no longer required to keep things moving. I began to suspect that attention was the last thing tying me here. Not my attention to the world's attention to me. And that was slipping. I tested it again one afternoon, deliberately this time. I walked into a crowded pharmacy during peak hours and stood directly in front of the counter. I didn't move aside, didn't look apologetic, didn't perform any of the small social rituals that signal cooperation. People queued behind me anyway. They lined up around asterisk me, instinctively adjusting as if I were a structural feature, like a column or a display rack. No irritation, no confrontation. The clerk looked past me, addressed the woman behind me directly. "What can I help you with?" I turned slowly. The woman flinched, not in fear but surprise, like noticing a coat draped over a chair that she could have sworn hadn't been there a second ago. "Oh, sorry," she murmured automatically. Then she stepped closer to the counter, and the clerk continued as if nothing had happened. I stood there another minute before leaving. No one noticed when I was gone. Outside, the sky was a dull, even gray, the kind that makes time feel stalled. I sat on the curb and watched cars pass. I tried to imagine being hit by one. Not graphically, not emotionally. Logistically. Would traffic slow? Would there be a report? Would my body register as an obstruction or simply not resolve properly? The thought disturbed me enough that I stood up and walked until it faded. I began avoiding places that relied on verification. Hospitals, government buildings, offices, anywhere that required a name to anchor you. Instead, I gravitated toward liminal spaces, places designed for passage, not presence. Hallways, transit platforms, underpasses, stairwells, places where being asterisk between asterisk was expected. I fit there. Once in a train station bathroom, I caught sight of myself unexpectedly in a mirror. The reflection didn't lag this time. It looked complete. Too complete. My clothes were cleaner than they should have been, my posture more composed, my expression neutral, calm, not hollow, asterisk, resolved, asterisk. I felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger. That wasn't how I felt. I raised my hand. The reflection followed perfectly. But something about the eyes was wrong, not vacant, not hostile. Finished. I stepped back quickly and left before I could think too hard about it. After that, I stopped seeking mirrors. Memory began to behave strangely. Not loss, compression. Events from before all this felt less distinct, as if they'd been summarized rather than recalled. I knew I had grown up somewhere, known people, loved some of them. But the emotional weight was gone. They felt like footnotes. I tried to hold onto specific moments, birthdays, arguments, small victories. But they slipped away as soon as I focused on them, like trying to remember a dream after waking. It occurred to me, then, that maybe memory required a future. That without a continuing narrative, the past had nothing to attach itself to. I wondered how much of myself the man with my name carried. Did he remember my childhood, my fears, or had the system generated a cleaner version, one without excess data? One afternoon, I followed him again, closer than before. He sat in a park, scrolling through his phone, sunlight cutting clean lines across his face. He looked peaceful, content in a way I couldn't remember feeling. A woman approached him. She smiled, sat beside him. They spoke quietly. I couldn't hear what they said, but their body language was intimate, familiar. Something twisted inside me. Not jealousy. Displacement. That should have been impossible, yet there it was. I stood a few yards away, watching my life branch without me. At one point he laughed. The sound hit me harder than anything else had in days. I turned away before it could do more damage. That night's sleep didn't come at all. Instead, I drifted in and out of a state that felt like pre-sleep, where thoughts surface unfiltered, unedited. I realized then that I was no longer afraid of disappearing. I was afraid of finishing asterisk, of reaching a state so smooth, so frictionless, that there was no longer a distinction between being absent and being unnecessary. I wondered if this was how people faded when no one needed them anymore. Not dramatically, not tragically, just efficiently. The city had systems for everything. Why not this? The next morning, I woke with the sensation that something had already happened. Like I was late, but not for an appointment. For myself. I checked my hands again. They looked normal, solid. But when I pressed my fingernail into my palm, the sensation arrived late, muted. I pulled my hand away before the discomfort could register fully. That scared me more than pain ever had. I started talking to myself quietly as I walked, not conversations, narration. Describing what I saw, what I felt, what I thought. It helped at first, anchored me. But over time, even my own voice began to feel external, like something I was overhearing rather than producing. I wondered how long before I stopped bothering, how long before silence felt natural. One evening, I noticed something new. People were no longer adjusting around me. They were walking through asterisk me. Not physically, not collision, but pathing. They cut through the space I occupied without hesitation, as if their mental maps no longer included me as an obstacle. I stood still in a busy crosswalk. No one diverted. A man passed so close his coat brushed mine, and he didn't react at all. I staggered backward, heart pounding. That was new. That was escalation. I retreated to the edge of the sidewalk and crouched there, breathing hard, watching the flow continue uninterrupted. For the first time, I felt truly optional. Not tolerated. Optional. That night under the overpass, I lay awake listening to the rhythm of traffic and felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. Acceptance, maybe. Or exhaustion. I thought about the drawer again, about how nothing inside it hadn't caused an alarm. An empty space didn't disrupt the system. It simplified it. I wondered how close I was to becoming that kind of absence. Not noticeable, not disruptive, just resolved. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and confusion, a quieter thought surfaced, one I didn't fully trust yet. That maybe this wasn't something being done to me. Maybe it was something the world expected me to agree to. And maybe, without realizing it, I already was. I don't remember deciding to stop moving. I just realized one morning that I hadn't gone anywhere the day before, or the day before that. I'd stayed within a few blocks of the underpass, drifting only when the space became inconvenient for someone else, when a sanitation crew arrived, when police cars slowed too much nearby. It wasn't fear that kept me there. It was suitability. The place didn't resist me. It didn't require explanation. I existed there in a way that felt permitted. That was when I understood that Part 3 had already begun, not as an event, but as a condition. The world no longer corrected for me. It assumed my absence by default. I tested the boundary one last time. Downtown, there's a municipal building with a wide set of concrete steps and glass doors that stay unlocked during business hours. I remembered voting there once. I remembered the smell of paper ballots and floor cleaner. I remembered being counted. I stood across the street for a long time before crossing. Every step felt heavier than it should have, like I was moving against a subtle current. Not resistance exactly, discouragement. The kind that doesn't forbid, just suggests there's no point. The doors opened. That surprised me. Inside, the air felt different, conditioned, neutral, like a place designed to be nowhere. A security desk sat just beyond the entrance. 2 guards, monitors, clipboards. I walked directly toward them. Neither looked up. I stopped in front of the desk and waited. Still nothing. I cleared my throat. The sound echoed slightly in the large space, but it didn't pull their attention. One guard laughed at something on his phone. The other sipped coffee. I leaned forward, close enough to see my distorted reflection in the polished surface of the desk. It was faint, incomplete, like a placeholder image. I stepped back slowly. As I turned to leave, someone brushed past me, entering the building. A woman in business attire, badge clipped to her jacket. She walked straight through the space I occupied, her shoulder passing through mine with only the barest sensation of pressure. Not pain. Alignment. Like 2 transparent layers passing over one another. I staggered outside and sat on the steps, breathing hard. That was the moment something finally broke through the numbness. Grief. Not for my life. For my asterisk position asterisk in it. I hadn't been erased violently. I hadn't been punished or selected. I'd simply failed to justify my continued specificity. The world had found a version of events that worked without me and committed to it fully. I stayed on those steps until evening. No one asked me to move. No one asked me anything. On the 3rd night after that, I dreamed again. This time the filing room was smaller, fewer cabinets, many drawers removed entirely, leaving clean rectangular gaps, empty frames. I found mine at the end of a row. The label was gone. The drawer was gone. There wasn't even an empty space where it had been. Just uninterrupted metal. When I woke, I felt lighter. That terrified me. I stopped trying to anchor myself after that. Stopped narrating, stopped recording details on scraps of paper. I let days pass unmarked. I let hunger come and go without urgency. When it rained, I got wet. When it was cold, I endured it. My body still existed, but it felt increasingly symbolic, like a reference object the world hadn't fully decommissioned yet. People rarely even adjusted around me now. I could stand in a doorway and watch foot traffic flow through the opening as if I weren't there. Not pushing past, not detouring, just not including. One afternoon, I caught sight of the man with my name one final time. He was across the street, laughing with someone I didn't recognize. He looked older than I remembered, not physically, contextually. Settled, integrated. Complete. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or loss. I felt relief. He was carrying it now, whatever it was supposed to be. The system had found its resolution. I turned away without watching him leave. That night, lying under the overpass, I became aware of a new sensation. A stillness, not the absence of movement, but the absence of expectation. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. No escalation, no reversal, no revelation. Just a gradual quieting, like the end of a long machine cycle winding down. I wondered if this was what death felt like to people who didn't dramatize it. Not a moment, a fade in administrative priority. I closed my eyes and listened to traffic until the sound flattened into something uniform and abstract. At some point, without ceremony, I realized I could no longer feel the edges of myself clearly. My hands didn't quite end where I expected them to. My breathing felt ambient, like it belonged to the space more than to me. I tried one last time to say my name out loud. The word formed in my mouth, but the sound didn't travel. Not silence, just no propagation, as if the air no longer recognized it as something to carry. That was when I understood the final truth. I hadn't been disappearing. I had already disappeared. What remained was an afterimage, persistence without relevance, a ghost not of the dead but of the unneeded. The world didn't erase me. It finished explaining itself without me. And when the last explanation no longer required my presence, even as an error, I felt the remaining weight lift. There was no darkness, no light, no sense of falling or release, just the quiet certainty that whatever continued from here would not include an observer. And that somehow felt right. The certainty didn't arrive all at once. It settled, like dust after a long period of disturbance. I don't know how much time passed after that last thought. Time had become less like a line and more like a condition, something the world used but no longer applied to me consistently. Light still shifted, weather still changed, but I wasn't moving through those changes so much as they were moving around what remained of me. I became aware of how little effort it took now to remain still. Not physically, internally. Thoughts no longer chased each other. They didn't branch or spiral. When one appeared, it stayed briefly, then dissolved without argument. There was no urge to hold on to it, no anxiety about forgetting. For the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of losing myself, because there was almost nothing left to lose. I noticed that my body had begun to behave like an object the environment no longer needed to track. I could sit for hours without discomfort, my legs numb but not painful. Cold registered as information, not distress. Hunger passed through me like weather, present then gone. Even breathing felt optional, not in a dangerous way, in a asterisk non-essential way. I started to understand something that frightened me less than it should have. The systems hadn't failed to see me. They had finished seeing me. Attention, I realized, wasn't infinite. It was allocated, prioritized, withdrawn when no longer efficient. And I had become inefficient. There was a morning when I woke to find the underpass empty. No people, no bags, no carts. Just concrete and sound. Traffic still passed overhead, but it felt farther away than usual, as if the space had been acoustically isolated. I sat up slowly, waiting for the familiar sense of being in the way. It never came. I stood. Nothing shifted around me. I walked out into the open, expecting at least the resistance of being misplaced. Instead, the world accepted the movement without comment. Pedestrians passed through the space I occupied without registering deviation. Their trajectories were clean, uninterrupted. I could see their intent, where they were going, how their paths were already decided, and I was no longer part of that calculus. I understood then that I wasn't marginal anymore. I was extraneous asterisk. There's a difference. Margins still matter. They define boundaries, they give shape. Extraneous things don't. They are simply excess. I wandered without purpose that day, not because I was searching for something, but because the habit of motion hadn't fully dissolved yet. I crossed streets without waiting for lights. Cars passed through me the way people did now, not colliding, not swerving. Their paths resolved as if I were a suggestion that had been politely declined. I felt no panic, only a mild, distant curiosity. At some point, I ended up near the river. I used to like it there. I remembered that vaguely, an impression rather than a memory. I stood at the railing and looked down at the water, dark and steady. My reflection didn't appear. Not missing, just unrendered. The surface held sky, buildings, movement, but not me. I waited just in case. Nothing changed. That was when the last remaining thread loosened. Not my name, not my history. My asterisk outline asterisk. I began to feel diffuse, like my awareness was no longer anchored to a single point. Sensation didn't radiate inward anymore. It spread outward, thin and even like fog. I wondered, briefly, if this was what it meant to become a place instead of a person. A condition rather than a subject. The thought didn't last. Thoughts were becoming inefficient, too. Later or earlier, it's hard to say, I found myself back near my old building. I don't remember choosing to go there. I just arrived. The windows glowed warmly. People moved inside. Lives unfolded with their familiar weight and specificity. I felt no bitterness watching them. The windows glowed warmly. People moved inside. Lives unfolded with their familiar weight and specificity. I felt no bitterness watching them. I couldn't even remember what it had been like to want something that sharply. The man with my name was there again. I saw him through the glass, moving through rooms that had once contained me. He looked tired, real. He paused at the window, staring out absently, and for a moment his gaze passed through the exact space I occupied. He shivered, just slightly. Then he turned away. That was the closest we ever came to intersecting. I felt no need to follow him anymore. Whatever continuity he carried was no longer adjacent to me. It didn't cast a shadow I had to stand in. It was complete, and I was resolved. The last sensation I remember distinctly was light. Not brightness, presence, the way light exists without asking whether it's being perceived. I stood somewhere, inside or outside no longer mattered, and felt the final administrative process conclude. Not with an ending, with a release. The world stopped accounting for me entirely. No adjustments, no compensations. Paths closed where I would have gone. Moments passed that no longer included a placeholder for my awareness. And there was no rupture when that happened. No absence, just continuity, cleaner now. More efficient. If there was anything like a final thought, it wasn't regret. It was recognition. I understood what I had been all along. Not an errors, not a victim, a redundancy. And redundancies don't vanish violently. They're phased out quietly. Once the system is confident it no longer needs them. There is no darkness after that. No silence. No watching from elsewhere. Because watching requires position. And position was the first thing I lost. What remains, if anything remains at all, is not something that can be described from inside. Only the knowledge that the world continues. Smoothly, as if I had never been necessary to explain it in the first place. There was no threshold to cross after that. No gate, no curtain, no final boundary that marked where I ended and something else began. What surprised me most was how ordinary that felt. The absence of drama, the lack of ceremony. I had spent so long bracing for a moment of significance that I hadn't considered how thoroughly significance itself could be withdrawn. I existed without being situated. That's the closest I can come to describing it. Awareness persisted, but it no longer belonged to me in the way it once had. It wasn't anchored behind my eyes or contained by a body. It drifted, thin, distributed, untethered. I wasn't observing from a point so much as registering conditions. Sound arrived without direction, light without source, sensation without boundary. And yet nothing felt wrong. The fear I'd expected never arrived. Neither did relief. Those required a self to experience them, and the self had been the first thing to thin out. What remained was closer to a residue of attention, a trace function that hadn't yet been fully deallocated. I understood then why the process had been so careful. Why it hadn't rushed. You couldn't simply remove someone, not cleanly. Not without destabilizing everything they were connected to. You had to let the connections decay first. Let meaning loosen. Let relevance dissolve. Only then could the removal complete without disturbance. I sensed the city continuing. Not visually, not auditorily. Structurally, I could feel patterns repeating, commutes, schedules, routines looping with quiet precision. Millions of decisions executing without reference to me. The system was healthy, balanced, optimized. There was a strange comfort in that. I had not been holding anything together. I had not been essential. That knowledge, stripped of ego, was neutral. Peaceful even. Occasionally, very faintly, I detected anomalies, small hesitations in flow, micro-pauses where something had once rooted through me and now had to resolve differently. They corrected themselves almost immediately. The system was learning to operate without even the memory of my absence. That was the final stage. I felt myself thinning further, awareness flattening into something like ambient pressure. Less thought, less narrative. The urge to reflect weakened, not through force but through irrelevance. Reflection requires contrast. There was none left. I tried, out of habit more than intent, to recall my face. It didn't appear. Not erased. Just inaccessible. The same was true of my voice, my name, my history. They weren't gone in the way objects are lost. They simply no longer had an address. I wondered dimly whether this was what people meant when they talked about being forgotten. Not remembered incorrectly. Not remembered faintly. But remembered nowhere. That realization didn't hurt. Pain requires ownership. And ownership had been gently, thoroughly revoked. If there was a final sensation, one last human echo, it was of alignment. Everything where it belonged. No excess, no gaps, no placeholders. The world was no longer explaining around me. It was explaining without me. And then, even that framing stopped making sense. Because explanation implies an audience. There was no audience anymore. Only continuation. If this account ends here, it's not because something stopped. It's because there is no longer a position from which stopping could be observed. The process completed. Quietly. Exactly as designed. There is less to say now, and that feels important. Not because something is missing, but because the need to fill space with description has faded. The compulsion to assert presence through language was one of the last habits to weaken. Words were always a way of insisting. I am here, I am perceiving this, I matter enough to be specific. Without that insistence, language loosens its grip. What remains is not emptiness. It's saturation. Everything at once without emphasis. I am not drifting forward. I am not suspended. I am not watching from above or below. Those metaphors assume orientation, and orientation assumes a center. There is no center anymore. If awareness still exists, and that itself is becoming a vague proposition, it exists the way humidity exists, distributed, indifferent to boundaries, present without needing to be acknowledged. I sense systems continuing to resolve. Not actively, automatically. Traffic patterns adjust to construction that hasn't happened yet. Schedules compress and expand. Digital records update themselves based on new inputs that no longer reference a missing node. The city learns. It always learns. The man with my name wakes up each morning and feels a low-grade unease he can't explain. It passes quickly. He chalks it up to stress. He drinks his coffee. He goes to work. He is not haunted. That matters. Nothing lingers on my behalf. The underpass still exists, but it no longer registers as a place where something ended. It's just concrete and shadow and sound. People pass through it without noticing any residue of what once occupied that space. I do not linger there either. Lingering requires attachment. Attachment requires a self. Occasionally, less and less often, there is a brief compression, a ripple where something almost coheres. A sense of asterisk about to be asterisk, but it never resolves into a thought. It dissipates before it can claim ownership. This is not decay. It is completion. I understand now that the process was never about removing me. It was about resolving redundancy. About closing a loop that no longer contributed new information. About freeing resources. That sounds cruel when framed in human terms, but cruelty requires intent. This had none. It was as impersonal as gravity, as neutral as evaporation. A system optimizing itself does not feel. It simply continues. If there is any remaining trace of emotion, and even that word feels inaccurate, it is a faint appreciation for how thorough the process was, how careful, how little disruption it caused. Nothing broke, nothing screamed, nothing had to be cleaned up afterward. I did not become a mystery. I did not become a story people tell. I did not become a cautionary tale. I became unnecessary, and then even that status expired. There is no moment beyond this, no perspective from which to say asterisk after asterisk, because after implies sequence, and sequence implies a point of reference. That reference has been released. If someone were to stand where I once stood, they would feel nothing unusual. No chill, no intuition, no sense of absence. The space would not remember me. And that is the final, quiet confirmation that the process succeeded. The world does not miss what it no longer needs to explain. And now neither do I. What follows isn't an addition so much as a thinning. A continuation only in the sense that inertia carries it forward a little longer before even that becomes unnecessary. Awareness, if that word still applies, no longer gathers itself into moments. There are no discrete impressions to report. Instead, there is a kind of constant equilibrium, a steady state where nothing presses hard enough to demand notice. This isn't peace. Peace implies contrast with unrest. This is neutrality without edges. If something like perception remains, it has become statistical rather than experiential. Patterns register but not as events. A million small adjustments occur continuously, none of them rising above the threshold of interest. The city breathes, systems reconcile, weather moves, none of it asks to be seen. I am not seeing it. Seeing requires a viewer. There is only registration now. I sense that the world has completed its audit. Every dependency rerouted, every reference cleaned, every contingency closed. There are no dangling threads, no unresolved variables waiting on a value that will never arrive. That work is finished. What remains is maintenance. I try, out of something like habit, to locate a boundary, to determine where whatever I am ends and something else begins. The attempt doesn't fail, it simply returns no result, like querying a dataset that no longer contains the field you're searching for. There is no error message, just silence where the query would have resolved. That feels important, if I could still feel importance. The last human impulse I can identify, faint, vestigial, is the desire to be understood, to leave behind a clean description of what happened, to make it legible. But legibility is for readers, and there are none here. Even this narration, if it can still be called that, is not being asterisk-produced asterisk. It is the residual pattern of a process winding down, like the last rotations of a fan after the power has been cut. Each turn slower, each quieter, until rotation itself is no longer a meaningful concept. I sense the man with my name less frequently now, not because he has changed, but because my ability to register him has diminished. His life proceeds with ordinary complexity. Small joys, minor frustrations, nothing remarkable. That normalcy is the final proof that the replacement was successful. No haunting, no echoes, no need for reconciliation. I do not envy him. Envy would require comparison. Comparison would require a self. The city continues to optimize. New data flows in, old data ages out. The present renews itself continuously, shedding what no longer serves it. This is not malice, this is function. I understand now that what frightened me at the beginning, the erasure, the replacement, the loss of address, was never the real threat. The real threat was believing I was irreplaceable. That belief was the only thing that caused friction. Once it dissolved, everything smoothed out. If there is a final state beyond this one, it is not something that can be occupied. It is not a place or condition. It is simply not being referenced. And that has already occurred. This continuation ends not because something stops, but because continuation itself has become unnecessary. There is no longer a point from which to extend. No voice to carry forward. No silence to contrast against. Just a system, at rest within itself, moving on without the need to mark that anything was ever removed. And that quietly, completely, is the end.